Okay, let's dig into this. Wildfires. I mean, they've become such a massive challenge right across the country.
Absolutely. You see the headlines, you sometimes smell the smoke even far away. It's impacting communities, the environment, the air we breathe. It just seems to be growing every year.
Yeah, the scale of the problem is huge. And it's complex, right? It touches so many different aspects of life and the landscape itself.
It really does. And tackling something this big, well, it requires looking at it from, all the angles. Policy, land management, technology, community readiness, everything.
Exactly. Which brings us to our source material for today's deep dive. We've got excerpts here from H.R.471.
Right, the Fix Our Forests Act. That's the official title.
Yeah. You can think of it as this major legislative proposal coming out of Congress. It's laying out a pretty comprehensive blueprint for how the U.S. could, well, change the way it manages federal and tribal lands.
And specifically focusing on preventing and responding to those really large, destructive wildfires we keep seeing.
Right. It's not just about fighting the fires once they start, is it?
No, not at all. There's a huge emphasis in this bill on proactive measures, getting ahead of the fires, making forests healthier, trying to speed up the work needed on the ground, and putting resources towards protecting the communities that are most directly, well, in the path of wildfire risk.
So our mission today is to really dive deep into this proposed law. We want to break down its key parts using, common terms and try to figure out what it actually means for the places and the people most affected.
And what's pretty interesting here is just how broad the approach is. Like you said, it's not just firefighting. It covers everything from how we define fire risk across these big landscapes, how we use data, maybe even artificial intelligence, to streamlining environmental reviews for projects, expanding collaboration with states and tribes, boosting research into, all sorts of things. Fire-resistant homes, using forest waste, even focusing on specific forest health issues.
Okay, so this deep dive is going to take you through the specifics, straight from the bill itself. Let's jump in and start by setting the stage. What's this bill fundamentally trying to achieve?
So the core stated purpose, right, of the Fix Our Forests Act, it's about expediting environmental review and improving forest management.
On specific lands.
Yes, specifically on National Forest System lands, Bureau of Land Management lands, BLM lands, and tribal lands. The big goal is to restore resilience, make these areas less prone to catastrophic fire, especially where they're overgrown and, really fire prone right now.
Okay, targeting specific land types and trying to speed up the work needed there. The bill also introduces, or maybe clarifies, some key terms we need to get a handle on. First up, there's this term you might not have heard. Fireshed.
Yes, fireshed. The bill defines it as a landscape area where there's a similar kind of wildfire threat and where a specific response strategy could actually, influence the outcome of a fire.
So it's a way of defining the problem area based on fire behavior and impact. Like a watershed for water, but for fire risk.
That's a good analogy, yeah, exactly. It helps define where management efforts might be most effective for a given threat.
Okay. Another key term, hazardous fuels management activities.
Sure.
This sounds like it describes the actual work the bill wants to accelerate.
Precisely. And it covers a whole range of treatments. Things like mechanical thinning.
Using equipment to clear trees and brush.
Right. Mastication, which is grinding up vegetation. Prescribed burning, so intentionally setting controlled fires. Cultural burning, which is specifically defined and practiced by tribal communities. Standard timber harvesting. And interestingly, grazing.
Grazing.
Yeah.
Listed right there as a fuels management tool. Using livestock.
Yep, it's explicitly included in that definition in the bill. It also draws on definitions from existing laws, like the Healthy Forests Restoration Act from 2003, for terms you're probably more familiar with.
Like?
Forest Plan, wildland-urban interface, the WUI.
The crucial zone where homes meet wildland.
Exactly, and at-risk community. Those definitions are pulled from existing law.
Got it. So we're talking about tackling fire risk in these specific geographic areas, these fire sheds, using a variety of techniques, and focusing efforts on protecting vulnerable places, especially where people live.
That's the framework. And Title I of the bill really dives into this landscape-scale restoration, trying to coordinate and speed up this work across large areas.
Okay, Title I. And it has a subtitle about addressing emergency wildfire risks in high-priority fire sheds.
Yeah.
So how does the bill propose identifying these high-risk areas, where do they focus first?
Well, initially it says areas can be designated as fire management areas based on a couple of things. Either the Forest Service's 2022 Wildfire Crisis Strategy,
Okay.
or by looking at the top 20% of firesheds based on 2019 data.
Top 20% based on what criteria?
Based on risk to communities, risk to municipal watersheds, and that explicitly includes tribal water sources, and also the risk of the forest being permanently sort of converted to a different ecosystem type after a severe fire.
And these designated areas, they can include federal and non-federal land, and they don't overlap.
That's right. They can include a mix of federal, state, tribal, private lands. And the bill specifies they should not overlap. After 5 years, there's a process laid out for updating these designations using new data from a registry map.
Okay, and here's a key point, right? The bill says designating these areas, that action itself isn't subject to environmental review under NEPA.
Correct. The designation step itself is intended to be streamlined faster.
Okay, so designation is quick. Now this next part sounds really interesting. The bill proposes establishing a fire center. Sounds like a kind of central command for wildfire data and strategy.
It does sound like that. It's envisioned as a new interagency center, jointly set up by the Secretaries of Agriculture and Interior. So think Forest Service and the U.S. Geological Survey, USGS, working closely together.
And its main purpose, what would it actually do?
Its purpose is stated as comprehensively assessing and predicting fire and smoke behavior across different jurisdictions using advanced data tools and explicitly mentioning the potential use of artificial intelligence.
Wow. AI for wildfire prediction. That feels like a potentially significant step, using advanced tech for this problem.
It certainly could be. The idea is that the information coming out of the center would be used for a lot of things, informing land and fuels management decisions, helping communities reduce evacuation strategies, predicting smoke impacts for public health. Improving fire response by helping figure out where to pre-position resources, and even guiding post-fire recovery efforts.
So it's meant to be this central engine for data, prediction, decision support, kind of across the entire life cycle of wildfire impact.
That seems to be the goal, yes. Other functions listed include pulling together data from all sorts of sources, trying to reduce duplication between agencies, promoting data sharing, streamlining how agencies buy and use technology.
Makes sense.
Making the data and the models publicly accessible, and maintaining something called the Fire Registry.
And the list of agencies involved is pretty long, isn't it?
It's extensive. Forest Service, BLM, National Park Service, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Fish and Wildlife Service, USGS, parts of DAD, DHS, Department of Energy, FEMA, National Science Foundation, NOAA for Weather and Climate, obviously NASA, NIST, U.S. Fire Administration. It's a big group.
That's a whole lot of expertise supposed to be coming together, trying to create a unified picture of the threat.
Exactly. A single point, hopefully, for comprehensive, integrated data. And that fires registry you mentioned, that's required to be a publicly accessible website, maintained by the director of this new center.
Okay, a public website. What kind of information would actually be on it for, anyone to see?
It's designed to be pretty detailed and hopefully useful for planning. It would include stuff like wildfire exposure risk, broken down by who owns the land, including utility rights of way, records of hazardous fuels treatments done over the last 10 years, specific details on what's actually at risk in these areas, communities, watersheds, tribal water, the risk of forest conversion, acres burned at high severity recently, spatial patterns of extreme fire events, and importantly, information on planned hazardous fuels management activities.
That planned activities part seems crucial for coordination, right? And transparency. How is this registry meant to help, say, a local community group or planner?
Well, the idea is to give communities the critical data they need when they're developing or updating their own wildfire protection plans. But it's also intended to be a searchable database to track the status of federal environmental reviews, permits, and authorizations for specific forest projects.
So transparency not just on the risk data, but on the process itself, like where is that permit at?
Yes, the bill says it's supposed to include things like permitting timetables, agency compliance status, explanations if things get modified, info about public meetings in relevant languages. It would also list projected project costs. And significantly, once projects are done, it's supposed to track their measured effectiveness in actually reducing wildfire exposure based on those risk criteria.
Wow. Transparency, process tracking, and performance measurement all built into this public system. The The bill also talks about shared stewardship. What's that about?
This is really about encouraging formal joint agreements between federal agencies, interior or agriculture, and state governors or Indian tribes.
Okay.
The goal is to work together across those jurisdictional lines to jointly reduce wildfire exposure in these designated fire areas and conduct assessments collaboratively. The bill actually requires federal agencies to try and enter into these agreements within 90 days of getting a request from a governor or a tribe.
So formalizing and trying to speed up that collaborative process. And these fire assessments are part of that shared stewardship.
Yes, exactly. These assessments are supposed to be conducted jointly by the federal agency and the requesting governor or tribe, ideally within 90 days of setting up the agreement.
And what do these assessments actually involve? What's in them?
They identify the wildfire risks using the best available science. Things like scenario planning, hazard mapping, really tailored to that specific fire. They also identify the specific at-risk communities within those areas.
And they identify potential projects, right? How does the bill say they should decide which projects get priority? That seems critical.
It is. This is a key prioritization step. The assessments create a list of potential fire management projects and then rank them. The bill sets the primary priority as reducing risk to communities, watersheds, including tribal water, and the risk of forest conversion.
Okay, those are top tier.
Yes. Secondary priorities include protecting critical infrastructure, think utilities, roads, wildlife habitat, especially for threatened or endangered species, the built environment generally, and tribal resources as defined by the tribe itself.
So a clear tiered system for choosing projects based on reducing the biggest risks first. What else is in these assessments?
They have to include strategies for reducing the threat, specifically in the WUI, timelines for implementing projects, longer-term goals for the area, making sure the proposed work fits with existing forest plans, and strategies for improving firefighter safety through the fuels treatments.
Okay.
And these assessments have to be regularly updated and, again, made publicly available. Local governments are also encouraged to participate in developing them.
Publicly available. That keeps coming up for data and plans.
Yeah.
And the science used for these assessments, anything specific about that? Like what sources?
Yes, the bill specifically says that the best available science should, to the maximum extent practicable, incorporate traditional ecological knowledge from Indian tribes.
Ah, interesting. Explicitly including tech.
Yes, alongside things like state forest action plans, risk plans, data from that new forest registry, and other government data sources.
Incorporating traditional knowledge alongside Western science. That's definitely a notable detail. And just like the designation of the areas, the act of conducting these assessments, that's also not subject to neighbor review.
That's what the bill states, yes. The assessment process itself is designed to be streamlined, to move relatively quickly.
Okay, so now we get to emergency fire management.
Yeah.
This sounds like where the policy really translates into, actual work on the ground. Boots and chainsaws, maybe?
Exactly. This section authorizes specific types of forest and vegetation management activities. It calls them fire management projects, and they happen specifically within those designated high-priority fire areas we've been talking about.
What kinds of activities are authorized under this sort of faster process?
It includes that range of work we discussed earlier, hazardous fuels management generally, creating fuel breaks, removing hazard trees, dead trees, dying trees, developing or maintaining those vegetation management plans for utility rights-of-way, addressing forests that are overstocked, using chemicals or reseeding to manage insects, disease, or invasive species. Basically, any activities recommended by those fire assessments or existing community wildfire protection plans.
And how does the bill expedite these projects? This seems like a core mechanism it's proposing to increase the pace of work.
Right. It takes existing streamlined environmental review authorities that are already in law, things like categorical exclusions or CEs.
Okay, those shortcuts in the review process.
Exactly. From laws like the Healthy Forests Restoration Act, the Big Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, it takes those existing tools and specifically says they can be applied to these fire management projects. It also points to specific sections of federal regulations and says they have the force and effect of law for these projects within the designated fire areas.
So it's not inventing totally new tools, but taking existing faster pathways and aiming them directly at these high priority areas.
That seems to be the main approach here, yes. And a really significant part of this is expanding the acreage limits for several of the categorical exclusions that come from those previous laws.
Expanded acreage limits. How much bigger are we talking? That sounds important.
It is potentially quite significant. They are increased from previous limits that might have been, say, 3,000 acres or 4,500 acres. up to 10,000 acres.
Wow.
But importantly, that 10,000 acre limit applies only for projects conducted within these designated fire management areas using those specific CEs.
10,000 acres. That's more than double the size for some of these streamlined reviews. That feels like a major lever designed to really ramp up the pace of treatments in those high-risk spots.
It certainly seems intended to allow for larger-scale projects to be reviewed more quickly in those priority zones. The bill also makes sure these processes comply with more recent NEPA amendments that came out of the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023.
Okay.
And it encourages agencies to combine these expedited authorities with other tools they already use for working across boundaries, like good neighbor agreements with states, stewardship contracts, and agreements with tribes under things like the Indian Self-Determination Act or the Tribal Forest Protection Act.
Layering different tools together for maximum efficiency in these priority areas.
Got it. But it sounds like this specific push, this subtitle on emergency fire management, is maybe time-limited.
It is. The authority provided under the specific subtitle for this kind of expedited fire management. It terminates 7 years after the act is enacted. It's presented as a focused, time-bound effort for those highest risk areas.
Okay, 7 years. Moving on to subtitle B under Title I, this one's titled Expanding Collaborative Tools to Reduce Wildfire Risk and Improve Forest Health. This seems to broaden the focus back out a bit to collaborative work beyond just those designated fire sheds.
Yes, exactly. This subtitle looks at existing collaborative programs and authorities and proposes changes to make them, more effective or more widely available. The first one is modifying good neighbor agreements.
Those are the agreements where federal agencies can partner with states to get management work done on federal land, right? That's the core idea. This bill modifies that existing authority to explicitly allow special districts, which it defines based on being specific political subdivisions with budget autonomy, and also Indian tribes to enter into these agreements directly with federal agencies.
So expanding who the federal government can officially partner with under these agreements. What about how the money generated from these agreements can be used? That's often a sticking point.
It is, and this is a crucial modification proposed in the bill. It allows the revenue generated, say, from timber sales under these agreements to be used not just for implementing the restoration activities themselves, but specifically for constructing new permanent roads if they're necessary for that restoration work, and approved through the environmental analysis, of course. And also for completing new permanent road construction that's specifically intended to replace and decommission existing roads that are harming forest health or watersheds.
So building needed access roads for restoration and fixing problems caused by old roads. Those become explicitly allowed uses for the money generated. That's a pretty specific use of that revenue.
That's right. Any funds left over after that can go towards other good neighbor agreements or cover administrative costs for the state, tribe, special district, or county partner. The bill also extends the sunset date for certain provisions related to these agreements out to 2030.
All right. Next up is stewardship end result contracting, another existing tool.
Yes, another existing tool being amended. These contracts let entities, often private companies, provide restoration services like thinning, and they can offset the cost by removing and utilizing the timber or biomass that comes out. The bill allows these contracts to be for a period of up to 20 years.
20 years. That's up from 10 generally,
That's
right?
Correct. A significant lengthening of the potential contract term.
Any other changes for these long-term stewardship contracts?
Yes, there's a special rule proposed for long-term contracts, defined here as over 5 years that are enacted after this bill passes. If the government cancels or terminates the contract for reasons other than the contractor being at fault, the government has to pay the entity doing the work 10% of the total contract amount to cover cancellation costs.
Okay. So a kind of built-in financial protection for contractors who commit to these longer-term, multi-year projects. Makes sense if you want longer commitments.
Seems to be the logic. The bill also explicitly adds retaining and expanding existing forest products infrastructure as one of the potential purposes for these stewardship contracts.
So directly acknowledging the need for mills and processing facilities to handle the material removed during restoration. Got it. The bill also proposes creating intra-agency strike teams. What are those for?
These would be teams established by the Secretaries of Interior and Agriculture. Their specific job is to accelerate and streamline the reviews and consultations required under major environmental laws, NEPA, National Historic Preservation Act, Endangered Species Act, specifically for these fire management projects. They'd also help with actually getting the projects implemented.
So dedicated teams, just to speed up the paperwork and approvals for these priority projects. Who would be on them? Just federal folks.
Well, the bill says they can include federal employees, but also contractors from nonprofits, state agencies, tribes, local governments, quasi-governmental agencies, academic institutions, private organizations, and volunteers.
Volunteers. On a strike team meant to streamline complex environmental reviews. There's a really broad mix of potential people involved. That's interesting. And this authority is also time limited.
Yes, the authority for these strike teams also terminates after 7 years.
Okay. Next, locally led restoration. What does this section do?
This adjusts the dollar threshold for what's considered a small timber sale under existing authority, often used for, local stewardship projects. It increases that threshold from $10,000 up to $55,000.
Whoa, that's a big jump. Over 5 times higher, aimed at making those smaller sales more accessible locally.
That seems to be the idea. And that new $55,000 threshold will be indexed to inflation starting January 1st, 2027.
Okay.
The bill also requires that bids under this adjusted higher authority must be specifically solicited for implementing fire management projects.
Gotcha. The bill also touches on some existing partnership programs like the Joint Chiefs Landscape Restoration Partnership Program. Any changes there?
Yes, it amends this program, which is a collaboration between the Forest Service and the Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS. It adds recovering from wildfires and enhancing soil, water, and other natural resources as explicit eligible purposes for funding under the program.
Broadening the scope a bit.
Right. It also requires more frequent reporting on the program's results, at least every 2 fiscal years, instead of just the initial reports that were required. And the funding eligibility for this program is extended through 2030.
Extending eligibility again. Seems like a theme for these collaborative programs. How about the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, the CFLRP?
Another existing program, yes, focused on funding large, collaborative, landscape-scale restoration projects. The bill amends it by adding things like monitoring for forest pathogens, standardizing monitoring questions across different projects, and including plans to support the collaborative processes themselves as criteria for selecting projects.
Any changes to what kinds of projects get prioritized for CFLRP funding?
Yes, several new selection criteria are added or maybe clarified. These include proposals that use innovative ways to get the work done, like those good neighbor agreements. Projects focused on removing insects and diseases, specifically mentioning bark beetles out west. Projects that facilitate the sale of things like firewood or Christmas trees, trying to connect restoration to local economies.
Right.
Projects that work across different land ownerships, especially in the WI. And projects that clearly enhance watershed health and protect drinking water sources.
Okay, so encouraging a broader range of activities that link forest health to community needs, local economies, and water. Are they allowing more proposals?
Yes. It increases the limit to 4 proposals per region per fiscal year. And, just like the Joint Chiefs program, its funding eligibility is extended. It was set to expire in 2023, but this pushes it out to cover fiscal years 2025 through 2030.
Okay. The bill also includes a specific section on utilizing grazing for wildfire risk reduction. We mentioned grazing earlier.
Yes, this directs the Secretary of Agriculture to develop a strategy, working directly with livestock permit holders to find more opportunities to use livestock grazing specifically as a tool for reducing wildfire risk on federal lands.
What would that strategy actually explore? What kind of options?
It lists several areas to look into. Reviewing how environmental laws apply to potentially allow grazing on vacant allotments during emergencies like drought or disaster that might displace livestock.
Okay.
Promoting targeted grazing in specific high-risk areas just to reduce fuels. Increasing the use of temporary grazing permits for quick fuels reduction or controlling invasive grasses. And exploring how grazing might be used as part of post-fire recovery and restoration efforts.
So trying to integrate grazing more intentionally into the overall wildfire management playbook makes sense. There's also a section on a water source protection program.
This amends an existing program under the Healthy Forests Restoration Act. It expands the definition of adjacent land to include non-federal land that's within the same watershed and contains important water sources or infrastructure.
And it expands who can be a partner in this program, too.
Yes, significantly. It broadens the list of eligible partners to include entities like sequoia associations, those traditional irrigation communities common in the Southwest. Public entities that manage stormwater, wastewater, or related infrastructure. Land Grant Mercedes, which is another specific type of historical land ownership association, and private entities that have water delivery authority.
Wow, that seems designed to bring a much wider range of water users and managers into projects that connect forest health upstream with water supply downstream.
Yeah.
What are the requirements or priorities for projects under this revised program?
Well, projects must be designed to protect and restore watershed health, water supply, and water quality, including municipal or agricultural water systems and infrastructure. And they also have to protect and restore the forest itself from threats like insects, disease, or wildfire.
So a dual focus on forest and water.
Exactly. Priorities are given to projects with benefits related to drought, wildfire, post-fire conditions, extreme weather, and climate resilience. Also, projects supporting aquatic restoration that complements the forest work, and projects that provide clear, quantifiable water benefits, including using nature-based solutions.
Focusing really specifically on those water benefits and resilience. And for projects on that adjacent land, you mentioned the private property part.
Yes, it explicitly requires the private landowner's written agreement for any project activity to happen on their non-federal land. It also clarifies that nothing changes the ownership or management rights of that adjacent land. It just allows specific project activities during the project's time frame. It also allows using existing watershed plans as the basis for management and requires cooperation with those non-federal partners.
Okay, so linking forest health directly to water resources and expanding who can participate. There's a mention of watershed condition framework technical corrections too. Minor stuff.
Yes, that just sounds like small language clarifications to existing text, cleaning things up.
Now, Title I wraps up with the subtitle C, litigation reform. This gets into how potential court challenges to agency actions related to these projects would be handled. This is often a pretty significant point of discussion around environmental management bills.
It definitely is. This subtitle includes several provisions aimed at altering or perhaps limiting how courts can review and respond to legal challenges, but specifically regarding what the bill calls covered agency actions under this act.
What actions are covered here? What does that apply to?
It seems to include actions like establishing one of these fire management projects, applying a categorical exclusion to one, preparing any environmental document for one, basically any official agency action that's part of implementing one of these fire management projects.
Okay, so challenges to the projects themselves or the environmental review process used to approve them. What does the bill say about a court's power in these cases? What can or can't they do?
Well, the bill states that a court shall not issue an injunction, a court order to stop a project if the court determines the plaintiff, the person suing, is unlikely to actually win their case on the merits. It also directs courts, when they are considering issuing an injunction, to specifically weigh the potential short and long-term environmental effects of doing the project against the potential short and long-term environmental effects of not doing the project.
That sounds like a different emphasis. Bringing the impact of inaction, like what happens if the fire risk isn't reduced directly into the legal consideration for stopping the project.
It does frame it that way. Furthermore, the bill sets specific limitations on when courts can halt or overturn these covered actions altogether. It says a court shall not hold one of these actions unlawful, set it aside, or otherwise stop or delay it unless the court finds two things. One, that the action poses a risk of a significant and immediate environmental harm, and two, that there is no other adequate legal solution available.
So that sounds like a very high bar for a court to completely stop one of these projects.
Yeah.
A significant and immediate harm and no other fix.
That appears to be the intent, yes. And if a court finds that high bar isn't met, the only remedy the court can order is to send the case back to the agency, remand it with instructions to fix whatever specific legal problem or adverse effect the court identified. And the agency has to do it within 180 days.
Okay, fix the specific problem quickly.
Right. And importantly, the bill says this fix generally cannot include ordering the agency to just start over and prepare an entirely new environmental document unless the court finds the agency was required to prepare one in the first place and simply failed to do so altogether.
So the focus is on fixing a specific identified issue within a tight timeline, but the project itself doesn't necessarily get stopped completely, and courts generally can't force a full redo of the environmental analysis unless it was skipped entirely.
That's the framework the bill lays out for these specific actions. The agency is allowed to continue with parts of the project that aren't affected by the required fix, and they can use simpler ways to correct documents, like addendums or memos to the file.
Are there also limits on when people can file these court challenges, a time limit.
Yes, the bill states that claims seeking judicial review of these covered agency actions are barred, meaning they can't be brought to court unless they are filed within 120 days of the agency providing public notice of the action.
A strict 120-day window to file a lawsuit. 4 months.
Correct. And for actions where the agency held a public comment period, the bill adds another layer. It says a party is only allowed to bring a claim in court if they actually participated in that administrative process, submitted a comment during a public period that was specific enough to notify the agency of the issue they had, and the claim they bring in court is related to that specific comment they submitted earlier.
So you basically have to raise the issue with the agency first during the public comment period, be specific about it, and then you only have that limited 120-day window to sue if you want to challenge it in court.
That's the process outlined in the bill for these types of projects. This litigation subtitle also includes one more specific provision related to Endangered Species Act, consultation on forest plans.
Okay, what does that address? How ES interacts with the big forest plans?
It amends the laws governing how the Forest Service and BLM create their overall land use plans, those forest plans. It states that the agencies are not required to reinitiate consultation under the Endangered Species Act when a new species is listed, or critical habitat is designated, or new information comes out about potential effects, unless that new information reveals effects of the plan itself that were not considered at all when the plan was originally approved or last amended.
Okay, let me see if I follow. So, if potential effects on species or habitats were already discussed and considered when the big plan was put in place, even if circumstances change later like a new species listing, they might not have to trigger a whole new plan-wide ESA consultation process, specifically for that broad land use plan, only if the new issue reveals something totally unconsidered before.
That seems to be the specific change proposed regarding how new ESA information triggers consultation requirements at the forest plan level as opposed to the project level.
All right. Let's shift gears now entirely to Title II, Protecting Communities in the Wildland-Urban Interface. This title feels very practical, doesn't it? Bringing the focus right to where fires directly threaten people and homes.
It definitely does. The first section establishes a community wildfire risk reduction program.
Another joint program between federal agencies. Seems to be a pattern.
Yes, a joint effort by the Secretaries of Interior and Agriculture, again required to be set up pretty quickly within 30 days of the bill becoming law. And it involves a long list of other agencies too, like FEMA, the U.S. Fire Administration, NIST, NOAA, reflecting that broad nature of the problem right there in communities.
What's the main purpose of this specific program? What's it trying to achieve?
The stated purpose is to support interagency coordination, specifically to reduce wildfire risk and damage in those WY communities, including tribal communities.
Was it coordination?
Yeah.
How? What would it actually do?
It proposes doing this by supporting research, including research by non-federal partners, helping tribes and local governments adopt fire-resistant building methods, codes, and standards, assisting communities in addressing the effects of wildfire, like damaged property or impacts to air and water quality, and encouraging public-private partnerships for doing fuels reduction work right in the WUI areas.
So research, safer building, helping with recovery, and doing fuels work, all focused right on that zone where development meets the wildland.
Yes. And the bill specifically calls for providing technical and financial assistance through streamlined, unified mechanisms. The idea is to encourage people to take risk reduction measures on their own private property and help mitigate the costs for communities wanting to adopt these fire-safe practices.
Streamlined mechanisms, like a more user-friendly way for communities or maybe even individuals to get help. That sounds needed.
That seems to be the concept. The bill actually directs the secretaries and the FEMA administrator to establish a single portal for a single uniform application. Communities could use this one application to apply for several different existing federal grant programs related to wildfire risk reduction.
Well, wait. A single combined application for multiple different federal grants. Anyone who's dealt with federal funding knows how complex that can be for local towns or groups. This sounds like a potentially very practical, helpful change.
That's the explicit goal stated in the bill to reduce the complexity and the length of the application process. They're also required to provide technical assistance to help communities actually use this portal and apply successfully. This portal and Uniform Application Authority also has that 7-year sunset clause.
Okay. There's also a community wildfire defense research program mentioned in this title. Another research focus.
Yes, this would expand the existing Joint Fire Science Program, which already funds a lot of wildfire research. The new focus here is specifically on performance-driven research and development R&D to test and advance innovative designs that make structures and even entire communities more resistant to wildfire ignition and spread.
Innovative designs for fire resistance. What kind of things are they prioritizing for this research? What are they looking at?
The priorities listed include research into affordable building materials, and it specifically mentions mass timber.
Mass timber. That's interesting, given it comes from wood.
It is. Also, home hardening strategies, including looking at policies to incentivize creating defensible space around homes, how subdivision layouts can impact fire spread, landscape architecture, and other building or community designs that could reduce vulnerability.
Mass timber highlighted for fire resistance research is definitely noteworthy. And the bill mentions some kind of prize competition, too.
Yes, a Community Wildfire Defense Innovation Prize. It's a competition for innovative designs for ignition-resistant structures or fire-adapted communities. The bill says to prioritize designs that have the potential to be scaled up, applied to existing infrastructure, not just new builds.
Okay.
And they're required to coordinate this with the Department of Energy's Building Technologies Office, presumably to avoid duplicating research efforts. This research program and the prize competition also sunset after 7 years.
Coordinating with existing building science efforts makes sense. Okay, next up is a section that feels incredibly relevant, especially given some recent tragic utility-cone fires. It's titled Vegetation Management, Facility Inspection and Operation and Maintenance Relating to Electric Transmission and Distribution Facility Rights-of-Way. Long title.
Yes, but it directly addresses managing vegetation around power lines, specifically where they cross federal land. And there's a major proposed change here regarding the distance for removing trees that pose a hazard near those lines.
Okay, how much is that distance changing? That seems like a key detail.
It increases the distance for removing hazard trees that could fall onto the line from the current standard, often cited as 10 feet from the line, out to 150 feet.
Wait, from 10 feet to 150 feet. That's a massive increase, 15 times further out. That means they could potentially manage trees far outside the immediate cleared right-of-way if they pose a risk of falling onto the line and causing an ignition.
Exactly. It aims to address the risk posed by those more distant, potentially unstable trees that could still hit the line. The bill also requires utility companies to consult with private landowners if hazard trees are identified on their land for removal, specifically where those trees pose a risk to a utility line located on adjacent federal land.
Ah, okay. So involving the neighboring private landowner if the risky tree is actually on their property but could hit the line on federal land. What about the whole process for getting the utility company's vegetation management plans approved for federal land? Is that changing?
The bill aims to streamline that and put some deadlines on the process. It states that if a utility submits a plan that doesn't require major changes, it's considered automatically approved after 120 days if the federal agency hasn't acted on it.
Automatic approval after 120 days.
If no modifications are needed, yes. If the agency does need modifications, the bill requires them to provide a detailed timeline for completing their review within 165 days total from submission. And they have to clearly list any deficiencies and provide specific ways the utility can address them to get the plan approved.
So aiming for clear deadlines and a more predictable, hopefully faster process for these critical utility vegetation management plans.
Yes, the goal seems to be reducing delays that can hold up essential safety work around power lines. And building on that, the bill establishes a new categorical exclusion under NEPA, specifically for electric utility line rights-of-way.
A whole new streamlined environmental review category just for managing vegetation around power lines on federal land.
That's right. It would apply to the development and approval of those utility vegetation management plans we just discussed, and also for routine activities carried out under those approved plans.
Are there any limitations on where this new utility line CE can be used? Any places it doesn't apply?
Yes, it explicitly states the exclusion does not apply in designated wilderness areas, or on any lands where vegetation removal is prohibited by other existing laws or land designations.
Okay. And what about building roads for this work? Can they build new roads using this CE?
It specifically prohibits establishing new permanent roads under this particular categorical exclusion. However, it does allow for maintaining and repairing existing permanent roads and also the use of temporary roads, provided those temporary roads are decommissioned within 3 years after the vegetation management activity is finished.
So facilitating the vegetation work, but trying to avoid creating new permanent road impacts where they weren't already planned. Got it. The bill also addresses a really foundational need for restoration. Seeds of success. What's this about?
This calls for a joint strategy. developed by the Secretaries of Interior, Agriculture, and interestingly, Defense within 2 years of enactment. The goal is to enhance the domestic seed supply chain for restoration.
Why focus specifically on seeds? Why is that a bottleneck?
Because after a major fire or insect outbreak or other disturbance, you need a robust supply of native seeds, often locally adapted and maybe even fire-resistant seeds and seedlings, to actually restore the landscape effectively. Natural recovery isn't always fast enough or successful.
Right. So what would the strategy do?
It aims for ongoing coordination between agencies on native plant materials and restoration efforts. It specifically promotes the reseeding of native or fire-resistant vegetation post-wildfire, especially in the WI. And it focuses on creating and sharing information about these plants, what's needed, what's available.
Does it mention things like building regional programs or seed storage?
Yes, absolutely. Prioritizing regions that don't currently have strong partnerships for seed collection and supply. And significantly expanding seed storage capacity, including cold storage, particularly for the Bureau of Land Management's National Seed Warehouse System. It also aims to shorten the permit timelines for collecting native seeds on BLM lands.
So really trying to address a practical bottleneck in getting landscapes restored after fire, getting the right seeds in the right places. There's a related program proposed specifically just for the Department of the Interior.
Yes, within 1 year, the Interior Secretary is directed to establish a program specifically to support priority reforestation and restoration projects on lands managed by interior agencies. That includes national parks, wildlife refuges, BLM lands, Bureau of Reclamation lands, BIA lands.
What kinds of projects would this Interior program focus on?
It focuses on lands identified annually as needing reforestation and restoration, specifically because of unplanned disturbances, wildfire, insects, disease, extreme weather, especially where natural regeneration isn't likely to happen effectively on its own. And a key part is ensuring they have adequate seeds and seedlings available for these priority projects.
So it links directly back to that Seeds of Success strategy, making sure the supply is there for Interior's needs.
It does, and the bill requires Interior to consult and collaborate widely on this program with state and local governments, tribes, universities, adjacent federal agencies, other stakeholders. The Secretary has to report annually to Congress on the lands identified, the projects supported, the progress made, contracts used, consultations held, and any gaps or funding needs identified. This program also has a 7-year sunset.
Okay. Finally, in Title II, there's a section on fire department repayment. This seems like it addresses a very real, practical issue for local fire departments, right? Especially volunteer departments that help fight fires on federal land.
It absolutely does. This is often a point of friction. It requires the federal secretaries within 1 year to establish standard operating procedures for timely payment under those reciprocal fire suppression cost share agreements, the ones where federal agencies and local departments help each other out on fires.
Reciprocal agreements,
Yeah.
Where maybe a local volunteer department sends engines to a Forest Service fire and then has to wait ages to get reimbursed for their costs.
Exactly that scenario. The bill requires that the new procedures must require the federal entity to reimburse a local fire department if they submit an invoice according to those new standard procedures. And it includes a sense of Congress, which isn't legally binding but expresses intent that payment should happen as soon as practicable, but explicitly states they should happen not later than 1 year after the fire suppression services were provided.
So a clear directive aimed at ensuring local fire departments, who are often critical first responders, get paid back in a predictable and timely manner, ideally within a year. That seems designed to address a long-standing source of frustration for many local departments.
Definitely seems aimed at that. Okay, moving into Title III, we look at transparency, technology, and partnerships. This title focuses more on how we get and use information and who is involved in finding solutions.
Subtitle A covers transparency and technology. The very first section is about biochar innovations and opportunities. Okay, let's start with the basics. What exactly is biochar in the context of this bill?
Right. The bill defines biochar here as carbonized biomass, basically. Plant material that's been heated with limited oxygen produced via thermal processing, specifically for non-fuel uses.
Non-fuel uses. So taking stuff like leftover wood chips from forest spinning, turning it into this stable charcoal-like material, but not just to burn it for energy.
Exactly. The focus here is on other applications, and the bill proposes demonstration projects to explore those. If funding is available, federal agencies, Forest Service, BLM, and the Department of Energy's Office of Science would partner with various groups.
Who would they partner with?
Eligible partners include governments at all levels, universities, nonprofits, private companies, even the national labs. They'd carry out projects demonstrating how to develop and commercialize biochar.
Where would these demonstration projects happen? Any specific locations?
They aim for at least one project in each Forest Service and BLM region across the country, and they'd prioritize projects that show potential for job creation and economic benefit, especially in rural areas.
Okay.
Projects demonstrating new uses for biochar, market viability, or benefits for forest health, soil health, or watersheds. And projects located in areas with high wildfire risk, readily available feedstock like forest residue, and potential market demand for the biochar.
And how could federal funding be used for these projects? What activities would it support?
Things like acquiring and testing the feedstock, developing both mobile and permanent biochar production units, demonstrating how to make biochar specifically from forest residue and then use it to improve forest health, helping build or expand production facilities, though funding for the capital costs of facilities is limited to 35%, and also funding research into new uses and market opportunities for biochar.
And where does the raw material, the feedstock for these projects come from? Is it specified?
Yes, to the maximum extent practical, at least 50% of the feedstock used in these demonstration projects is required to come from forest thinning and management activities, including mill residues sourced from federal lands.
So explicitly linking it back to using the material that's removed anyway during forest health treatments, that creates a potential end use for that material, connecting back to the landscape management goals.
Exactly. It creates a potential value stream for material that might otherwise be burned in piles or left. The bill also requires regionally specific research on the effects of using biochar.
What kind of effects are they interested in studying? What are the potential benefits they want to explore?
A pretty wide range. How biochar impacts forest health is potential for carbon capture and sequestration, locking carbon away in the soil long term.
Right, climate benefits.
Its effects on agricultural productivity and soil water retention, its impact on soil and grassland health in grazing areas, and its potential for environmental cleanup, like remediating contaminated soils. They'd also look at its effectiveness as a co-product if you're making biofuels, or its use in making biochemicals.
So, a really broad range of potential benefits to research. There's also a separate biochar research and development grant program proposed.
Yes, the Interior Secretary, working with the Energy Secretary, would establish or expand an existing competitive grant program. This would be for eligible institutions like land-grant colleges and universities. These grants would fund applied research focusing on many of those same areas we just talked about: biochar's effects on soil, water, carbon storage, how to best use it, regional applications, new byproduct uses, and how to expand the market and create jobs related to it.
So pushing both the practical demonstration projects and more fundamental research into biochar. Are these biochar authorities also time-limited like some of the others?
Yes, the authorities for both the demonstration projects and the grant program terminate after 7 years. The secretaries are also required to report back to Congress within 2 years with recommendations on policies, programs, future research needs, and any barriers they identify to commercializing biochar, like permitting or siting issues.
Okay. Next up is a section on accurate hazardous fuels reduction reports. This sounds like a push for better data quality and transparency about the fuels reduction work that's actually getting done.
It definitely is. Starting with the next fiscal year after enactment, the relevant secretaries, Interior and Agriculture, must include a specific report in the President's annual budget documents. This report has to detail how many acres of federal land received hazardous fuels reduction treatments the previous fiscal year.
What kind of information is required in that report? What details do they have to provide to Congress and the public?
It needs to record the total completed acres, clearly note if those acres were located within the wildland-urban interface, WI. List the wildfire risk level high, moderate, or low of those acres before the treatment and after the treatment. Distinguish between work done as part of a planned project versus work done during a wildfire that was managed for resource benefits, like letting a natural fire burn under certain conditions.
Important distinction.
Yes. List the cost per acre for the treatment, the specific region or administrative unit where it happened, and critically report on the measured effectiveness of the activities in actually reducing wildfire risk.
That effectiveness piece seems really key. It's not just about counting how many acres got treated, but trying to measure if it actually worked to reduce the risk level. And this report has to be publicly available.
Yes, the bill requires it to be made publicly available on the agency websites. It also requires the agencies to implement standardized procedures for tracking all this fuels reduction data within 90 days of the bill being enacted.
Standardized procedures for data collection. That speaks directly to getting better, more consistent data quality, doesn't it?
Yes. The goal is to improve accuracy and timeliness. This includes things like setting up regular reviews to check the data, using verification methods, analyzing how effective the treatments are in both the short term and the long term, and having clear methods to distinguish between WUI and non-WUI acres when a single treatment activity might cross that boundary. A report on these new procedures has to go to Congress shortly after they're implemented.
And there's a GAO study required on this reporting, too. The Government Accountability Office.
Yes, the GAO is directed to study how well this whole reporting and tracking section is implemented within 2 years. They need to look at any limitations they find in the reporting or tracking and report their findings back to Congress. The bill notes, though, that no additional funds are specifically authorized just for this study. GAO is meant to do it with their existing resources.
Okay. Moving on, there's a proposal for a public-private wildfire technology deployment and demonstration partnership. Sounds like trying to get new tech out there faster.
That seems to be exactly the goal. It calls for a pilot program established by the Secretaries of Interior and Agriculture within 1 year, coordinating with a whole host of other agencies involved in wildfire, federal land managers, NOAA, USFA, FEMA, NASA, BI, DOD, tribal, and local fire agencies.
Wow, another big coordination effort. What's its core purpose?
Its core purpose is the deployment and demonstration of new and innovative wildfire prevention, detection, communication, and mitigation technologies, getting them out of the lab or off the drawing board and tested in real-world conditions.
So helping new tech cross that infamous valley of death from research to actual operational use on the fire line or in prevention.
Exactly. They're required to integrate this pilot program into the National Wildfire Coordinating Group, NWCG, which helps set standards and practices for wildland fire across agencies. They'll work with agencies to identify key technology priority areas.
Like what kind of tech areas?
Things like improving fuels treatments, maybe new equipment or methods, better dispatch systems, remote sensing for detection and tracking fires, improved firefighter safety equipment, common operating pictures so everyone sees the same map during an incident, and making sure different data systems can actually talk to each other, interoperability.
And how would, say, a private company or a university research group get involved in testing their new gadget or software?
The program aims to connect these participating entities, private sector, nonprofits, higher education, with the appropriate agencies for real-time, on-the-ground testing of their technologies. This could happen during mitigation work, training exercises, maybe even on active incidents where appropriate and safe.
How do they prioritize which technologies or which groups get to participate in this pilot?
They are directed to give priority to entities that have already participated in NOAA's Fire Weather Testbed, which is a place where fire weather forecasting tools get tested, or entities that are developing and applying emerging technologies. And the bill lists examples like artificial intelligence, quantum sensing or quantum computing, thermal satellites, augmented reality for firefighters, 5G networks, nomadic mesh networks for communications in remote areas, and device-to-device communications.
Whoa, emerging tech like augmented reality and quantum sensing being specifically called out for application to wildfire.
Yeah.
That's really looking towards future capabilities, isn't it? Pushing the envelope.
It's a clear signal that the bill wants to explore and potentially accelerate the adoption of cutting-edge solutions. They're also required to do public outreach about these priority areas to encourage participation. Annual reports to Congress are required covering who participated, what tech was tested, estimated costs if it were scaled up, outreach efforts, and recommendations for new tech. This pilot program authority also sunsets after 7 years.
Okay. There are a couple of other interesting studies required in this subtitle as well. Not programs, but studies.
Yes, one directs the Government Accountability Office, the GAO again, to study several aspects of Forest Service policies within 3 years.
What policies?
This study includes evaluating how effective Forest Service firefighting operations currently are, looking at transparency and accountability in their budget and accounting practices, and, significantly, studying the suitability and feasibility of establishing a new, dedicated federal agency specifically just for wildland fire suppression on federal lands.
Hold on. A study looking seriously at whether we need a completely new federal agency focused only on fire suppression, separate from land management. That's a pretty fundamental organizational question to be asking.
It is indeed a potentially major shift if it were ever recommended and acted upon. Another study directs the Forest Service chief to evaluate potential locations for a Western headquarters for the Forest Service. This study needs to happen within 5 years.
A Western HQ for the Forest Service. They're mostly based in D.C. now, right?
Primarily, yes. This study must look at potential locations in at least 3 states west of the Mississippi River and analyze the potential benefits. Things like improved customer service for Western stakeholders, better recruitment and retention of staff out west, potential efficiency gains, and cost savings.
So, looking at how the agency is structured geographically, and whether a stronger physical presence out west makes operational sense. Interesting. The bill also includes a section on keeping forest plans current and monitored. These are the big guiding documents for each national forest, right?
Exactly. They're supposed to guide management for 10-15 years. This section directs the Secretary of Agriculture, so the Forest Service, to ensure that these forest plans comply with the existing requirement that they be revised roughly every 15 years. It prioritizes getting plans that are currently out of compliance revised, although it adds a clarification.
What's the clarification?
It clarifies that a forest plan isn't considered in violation of the law solely because more than 15 years have passed since its last revision. So, being overdue isn't automatically a legal violation in itself, but the direction is still to prioritize getting them updated.
Okay. What kind of transparency is required for these plans under the bill, making them accessible?
Yes. Within 120 days, the Secretary must report to Congress on the last date each individual forest plan was revised, amended, or modified. If a court orders a change to a plan, the Secretary is directed to try and publish a new, complete, consolidated version of the plan, incorporating that change within 60 days, assuming funding is available.
And making these plans easy for the public to find. That can be tricky now.
Right. The bill requires maintaining a central, publicly accessible website. This website needs to have links to the most recent official version of each forest plan, ideally as a single, consolidated document that includes all amendments and relevant court orders, and also a link to the most recent monitoring report for that forest unit.
So one clear, official place for the public or anyone to find the current, legally binding version of the management plan and see how the forest is actually being monitored against that plan. That seems useful.
That appears to be the intent. The bill also includes a kind of enforcement mechanism. It says that if the Secretary isn't acting expeditiously and in good faith, using available funding to make a required or court-ordered change to a plan, then that earlier protection, the part saying they aren't in violation just for passing the 15-year mark, becomes void for that specific plan. And in that situation, a court may order accelerated completion of the necessary plan changes.
So adding a potential mechanism for courts to compel action if plans are languishing and not being kept current is required despite funding being available. Got it. There are a couple of other very specific sort of one-off studies mentioned here too.
Yes, very specific. One requires the Secretaries of Interior and Agriculture to jointly evaluate a particular piece of firefighting technology called the Container Aerial Firefighting System, or CAFS. They have to do this within 90 days, consulting with aviation experts, and report their findings to Congress within 120 days.
So a quick assessment of a specific type of air tanker technology, basically.
Seems like it. There's also another study directed specifically to the Forest Service. This one is to look at pine beetle infestation, but focusing specifically on the northeastern region of the United States. That study needs to happen within 1 year.
Pine beetles in the Northeast. Usually you hear about them out west.
Right. This directs a specific look at the causes, effects, and potential solutions for that particular forest health threat in the Northeast. So shifting focus from fire to another type of forest disturbance and honing in on a specific region.
Okay. Finally, under this subtitle, there's a section on fire-safe electrical corridors. This sounds related to the power line vegetation management we talked about earlier.
It is related, but slightly different. This section allows the Forest Service Secretary, when issuing special use permits or easements for electric utilities that cross National Forest System land, to grant permission within that permit for the utility to cut and remove trees or other vegetation within the vicinity of their distribution or transmission lines without requiring a separate timber sale process.
Okay. So the utility, as part of their permit to operate the line, can directly manage the vegetation posing a risk to their lines without needing the Forest Service to go through a separate process for selling any trees that need to be removed.
Yes, provided the cutting and removal is consistent with the overall forest plan and other environmental laws. If the utility does decide to sell the removed material, they are required to provide the proceeds, minus their transportation costs, back to the Forest Service. But, and this is explicit, the bill states the utility is not required to sell the material. This seems designed to make routine vegetation management around power lines on federal land potentially more direct and faster for the utilities to carry out themselves.
Okay, subtitle B of Title 3 shifts focus pretty dramatically. It's titled White Oak Resilience.
Yes, this is quite interesting. After discussing all these broad strategies, technologies, and processes, the bill suddenly zooms in very tightly on one specific tree species, white oak. This really highlights that forest health isn't just about fire risk reduction or overall timber volume, right? It's also about the health and resilience of specific ecological components that might be particularly important culturally, economically, or ecologically.
Why white oak specifically? Is it particularly vulnerable or especially valuable? What's the story there?
White oak is a really foundational species in many eastern and midwestern forests. It's crucial for wildlife habitat. Acorns are a major food source. It's incredibly important for the timber industry, especially for high-value products like barrels for aging bourbon and wine.
Ah, the cooperage industry.
Right. Exactly. And white oak populations face significant challenges. Problems with regeneration, changing fire regimes, pests and diseases, impacts from climate change. There are real concerns about the long-term future of white oak forests. So the bill establishes a White Oak Restoration Initiative Coalition.
What is this coalition? Who's in it?
It's established as a voluntary collaborative group. It would include federal, state, tribal, and local governments, as well as private landowners, nonprofit organizations, industry groups, universities, basically anyone with a stake in white oak. And it seems to build on collaborative work that's already been started by groups interested in white oak.
And what would its responsibilities be? What's it supposed to do?
Its duties are to coordinate white oak restoration efforts across all these different groups and to make recommendations on policies and programs. These recommendations would cover things like addressing policies that might be hindering white oak health and regeneration, finding ways to increase the pace and scale of restoration work, improving communication and collaboration, especially across land ownership boundaries, identifying and addressing research gaps, specifically for white oak, doing outreach to private landowners, since a lot of oak forests are privately owned, and improving the quality and quantity of white oak seedlings available from tree nurseries.
Addressing specific bottlenecks, like nursery stock, but just for white oak, seems like a very practical focus for this kind of initiative. Would federal agencies support this coalition?
Yes. The bill directs the Secretaries of Interior and Agriculture to provide personnel support. And the Secretary of Agriculture may make funds available from a specific account related to the Farm Bill for the coalition's work, subject to appropriations, of course.
Okay. The bill also proposes specific pilot programs just for white oak restoration.
It does. The Forest Service is directed to establish and carry out 5 pilot projects located in national forests. These pilots would be aimed specifically at restoring white oak using various restoration and regeneration practices consistent with the local forest plans. At least 3 of these projects must be on national forests that have a specific historical designation reserved or withdrawn from the public domain.
And the Department of the Interior also gets white oak responsibilities under this bill, not just the Forest Service.
That's right. The Interior Secretary is required to assess lands managed by interior agencies, places like national wildlife refuges, maybe abandoned mine lands, to see where white oak is present and what the potential is for restoration there. They can use information from existing efforts like that White Oak Initiative and the Forest Service. A report on these findings is due to Congress within 90 days and has to be publicly available.
Okay.
And after that report, the Interior Secretary is also directed to establish and carry out 5 pilot projects in different interior land areas focused on white oak restoration and regeneration. Both the Forest Service and the Interior pilot programs are given authority to enter into cooperative agreements to get the work done, and both pilot program authorities sunset after 7 years.
Okay, 5 pilots each for Forest Service and Interior. There's also a broader white oak and upland oak habitat regeneration program established by the Secretary of Agriculture. Sounds like maybe a grant program?
Yes. This is described as a non-regulatory program to be set up within 180 days. Its purpose is to use the best science to identify, prioritize, and implement white oak restoration and conservation across landscapes, working beyond just federal lands. It's required to collaborate with that White Oak Restoration Initiative coalition we talked about. And it has to adopt a science-based strategy that is cost-effective, has measurable results, and this is very specific, explicitly aims to maximize outcomes with no net gain in federal staff.
No net gain in federal staff. That's a very specific constraint written into the law for how this program should operate. Interesting.
It is. The program would also establish voluntary grant and technical assistance programs. Its stated purposes are quite broad: coordinating restoration across different entities, improving oak forests and habitat for wildlife, increasing white oak growth across all land ownerships, helping with strategic planning for climate resilience related to oaks, engaging the public through outreach and education, and increasing scientific capacity related to white oak management.
And the grant program part specifically, how would that work?
It directs the Secretary of Agriculture to enter into a cooperative agreement with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and FWF, that's a well-established nonprofit conservation organization, to actually manage and administer this grant program. NFWF would receive the federal funds annually in advance, subject to appropriations, and run the competitive grant process. This program, including the grants managed by NFWF, also sunsets after 7 years.
Okay. The bill also seems to connect back to that issue of seedling supply, but maybe addressing it more broadly here than just for white oak.
It does. This section directs the Secretary of Agriculture, acting through the Forest Service, to develop and implement a national strategy within 1 year, specifically to increase the capacity of federal, state, tribal, and private tree nurseries to address nationwide seedling shortages for reforestation.
A whole national strategy just focused on nursery capacity. That sounds like a big deal for long-term reforestation efforts.
It could be very significant. The strategy needs to be coordinated with existing national reforestation plans. It must be based on the best science and needs to identify specific regional shortages for both bare root seedlings and containerized seedlings.
Okay.
Identify where the biggest reforestation opportunities are and what the specific seedling supply needs are in those regions. Look for opportunities to improve seedling diversity and build up seed inventories, and identify barriers that are preventing expansion of nursery infrastructure across the country.
That really gets down into the critical logistical details needed to support future large-scale reforestation efforts, whether post-fire or for other reasons. Finally, on white oak, there's mention of specific research needs.
Yes. The Secretary of Agriculture is authorized to enter into agreements, MOUs, with Indian tribes or institutions, including land-grant colleges, for collaborative research focused specifically on white oak.
What kind of research topics?
It lists a wide range, exploring white oak genetics, especially for stress resistance and tolerance, factors affecting tree vigor, survival, and growth, how to establish a diverse white oak seed bank, ensuring a sustainable supply of seedlings and genetic material, how to align seed sources with future climate conditions, different methods for reforestation, both natural and artificial planting, strategies for retaining and increasing white oak trees within mixed forests, reforesting abandoned mine lands, specifically with white oak, and looking at the economic and social aspects of managing white oak resources. This research authority also sunsets after 7 years.
Okay, that covers Title III. Now, Title IV is mentioned in the structure of the bill provided in our sources, but the specific text outlining the program itself isn't included in the excerpts we have, right?
That's correct. We know Title IV covers the Wildland Fire Management Casualty Assistance Program. While we can't detail its specific provisions from the text available to us, its inclusion as a major, distinct title in the bill clearly shows that supporting firefighters and their families in the event of serious injuries or line-of-duty deaths is also considered a crucial component of this proposed legislation's overall approach to wildfire management, addressing the human cost.
Right. Taking care of the people on the front lines.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's try to take a step back now and wrap our heads around this. What does this all mean? This proposed Fix Our Forests Act, H.R.471. It lays out an incredibly detailed, really multi-pronged strategy to try and tackle the wildfire crisis.
It really does. It covers everything from, defining these high-risk fire areas and creating that central data hub, the Fire Center, that aims to use advanced technology like AI to trying to streamline environmental review processes, especially for management projects in those high-risk areas. Expanding collaborative efforts with states, tribes, and local partners. Boosting research into things like fire-resistant communities and using forest material for biochar. Improving that critical supply chain for seeds and seedlings needed for restoration, and even drilling down to address the specific health and resilience of important species like white oak.
And it also digs into some very practical operational issues too, doesn't it? Like changing the rules for managing vegetation around power lines on federal land, hopefully reducing ignition risk, and aiming to ensure local fire departments who help out on federal fires actually get reimbursed more quickly and predictably.
Absolutely, those ground level issues are in there too.
So here's where it gets really interesting, maybe. Legislation like this, it's attempting to navigate and balance some incredibly complex tensions, isn't it?
It really is. It's trying to enable necessary land management work, increase the pace and scale of treatments to reduce fire risk, while also trying to ensure environmental protection, even as it proposes streamlining review processes.
Right.
It's trying to address community safety by working across public and private land boundaries in the WUI, and it's clearly trying to leverage advanced technology and data to make better, maybe faster decisions in a really complex environment.
And bills like this, they often spark a lot of debate, don't they? People raise questions.
Always. Questions inevitably arise about whether the proposed mechanisms for speeding up environmental review, like expanding those categorical exclusions, strike the right balance. Is it fast enough to make a difference on the ground, but still thorough enough to protect important natural and cultural resources? And there are always questions about implementation. Will the funding actually materialize? Will the agencies have the capacity, the people, the expertise to actually implement all these ambitious new programs, partnerships, and reporting requirements effectively across millions and millions of acres?
Those are definitely the big questions that follow any major legislative proposal like this. So this deep dive has given you, our listener, a detailed look inside the specific proposals contained within H.R. 471, the Fix Our Forests Act, pulling directly from the text provided in our sources. It really highlights the sheer scale of the wildfire challenge we're facing and the diverse, sometimes quite novel approaches being considered in policy circles to try and address it.
Yeah, and maybe for you, the takeaway thought is, how effective will these proposed changes actually be in reality if they become law? Will streamlining environmental reviews truly lead to faster, more impactful treatments on the ground in those highest risk areas without unintended consequences?
Right. And what role might these technologies, from AI for prediction to biochar for utilizing forest residue and these expanded collaborative efforts, truly play in shaping the future of how we manage our lands and build wildfire resilience across the country in the years to come?
It's definitely something to mull over the next time you see news about wildfires or read about forest health initiatives, or maybe even look at a stand of oak trees thinking about that white oak section. It's such a complex problem with so many layers, and policy like this is one significant piece of the puzzle trying to make a difference.